Alright, so we have now seen the entire spoiler list for Bloomburrow, and I'm pretty excited about this set. I think this is going to be a very popular set. I think the theme is very appealing, and also it looks like there's a lot of very good cards in it. I spoke a little bit about how I think this set seems very aggressive, but I've also taken some time to look through the spoilers and come up with a list of what I think are the top 10 cards in this set. And I think some of them might be a little bit surprising to you. But before we get into the actual top 10, we're going to go over just a few honorable mentions that originally might have been on the top 10 list, but I still wanted to at least talk about them a little bit anyway. We're going to start off with one that I think might be my favorite card in the set. I mean, just look at this guy. But I really wanted to put this in the top 10, but I'm just not quite sure about it yet, but I think it has a lot of potential. Mainly because this kind of reminds me of Eidolon of the Great Revel. It is a pretty different card, but basically it's an aggressive 2-drop that your opponent will have to spend 2 life to get rid of if they want to get rid of it. So it has that going for it, and then it also does a lot more as well, but I do quite like this card. There's actually another lizard here that I want to talk about as well. This is Hearthborn Battler. This one seems very good to me as well, and I did want to put it in the top 10, but once again, I'm not quite sure about this. But what I really like about this is that it kind of has the Ledger Shredder effect, where it triggers when a player casts their second spell each turn, and that's proven to be very powerful. I find myself, when I'm playing against Ledger Shredders, forgetting that that triggers when I cast multiple spells, and I think that's going to happen with this card as well. Here's another card, Feed the Cycle, that I think this card is really good. This is basically Hero's Downfall, but better. Like, this is just a straight up better version of Hero's Downfall, and that card was very good in the past. I mean, by today's standards, it's not as good as it was, but I think this is a really good removal spell. There's also this card, Darkstar Augur. I think this one has a lot of potential. So the obvious comparison to this one is Dark Confidant, and one of the main reasons why people don't play Dark Confidant anymore is because it has 1 toughness. Well, this one has 3 toughness. It does cost 1 more mana, but then it also has the Offspring ability, so you can get basically 2 copies of this for 4 mana. Yeah, one of them is going to be a 1/1, but you'll still get 2 instances of this triggered ability. And then the last honorable mention is this one right here, Emberheart Challenger. Mainly because I'm kind of a sucker for red aggressive cards, and this one is very good. I have no doubt that it would see play in Standard, except for the fact that there are so many good red 2-drops that I'm just not sure if this would make the cut, but I really want this to be good. So now on to the actual top 10 list. What do we have starting off at number 10? This card, this might upset some people for how low I have this on the list, but I do have it in the top 10. This is 3 Tree City. This is a card that a lot of people are excited about. It's a legendary land. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. You can tap to add a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap and choose a color. Add an amount of mana of that color equal to the number of creatures you control of the chosen type. So the immediate comparison for this is to Nykthos Shrine of Nyx. They look very similar and they have similar effects. This is a good card, it's true, but I think this is also an overhyped card. I don't think this card is as good as Nykthos, and I think a lot of people might be overvaluing it just because of how similar it looks to Nykthos. So the reason why I don't think it's as good is because Nykthos counts the number of mana symbols that you have in play, but also that means that just one card can provide many mana to Nykthos. You know, say you have something that costs between 3 and 5 mana, but all of it costs colored mana symbols. That means that that card is going to generate mana just by itself with Nykthos. This card, it can kind of do that, but not as efficiently, because you can get multiple mana out of single cards with this by playing things that generate multiple tokens, like say for example Hop to It, which is in the set as well. That would provide 3 mana to this card. But outside of token generation like that, this is only ever going to give you 1 mana per creature that you have. And also this really narrows you down into playing just a single creature type, which is great for tribal decks, especially Commander tribal decks. I think this card is going to be awesome in Commander, but outside of Commander, I'm not sure yet. So yes, I definitely think this is a good card. I just think it's being a little bit overvalued at the moment, but I do have it in the top 10 here. So moving on to the next card, at number 9, we have a creature. This is Valley Mightcaller. It's just a 1-drop. It's a 1/1 for a green. It's a frog warrior. It has trample, and it says whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on Valley Mightcaller. So I talked about this in my other video if you saw that, but I'm going to basically say the same thing here, where this is very similar to Pelt Collector, and that was a very good card. It saw tons of play in Standard, but I think that in the right deck, this card is a lot better than that. Because if you're playing a deck that has lots of creatures of these 4 creature types, this can grow really big, really fast. I'll mention Hop to It again. If you play that card, that's going to immediately turn this into a 4/4 with trample. And then in my other video, I also laid out the kind of dream scenario where, say on turn 1 you start with this, on turn 2 you play 2 more copies of it, and then on turn 3 you play Hop to It. That means that you're going to have 15 power and toughness worth of Valley Mightcallers in play, which can be attacking on turn 3. And that does seem kind of like a dream scenario, but it's not that difficult to pull off actually, because that's only 4 specific cards that you would need out of a potential, like 11 cards you'll have seen by turn 3. But yeah, I think this card is pretty sweet. Next up, at number 8, we have an instant. This is Dawn's Truce. It costs 1 and a white, so 2 mana. It has Gift a card, and it says you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. If the gift was promised, permanents you control also gain indestructible until end of turn. So Heroic Intervention is a good card, and this is kind of that, but in white. With Heroic Intervention, a lot of the time it's mainly the hexproof that you're using to protect your stuff. This card also gives you hexproof as well, though, so you could use this to stop like a Thoughtseize or something like that. Like you don't have to gift the card, but even if you do, your opponent draws 1 card, but you get to give all of your stuff indestructible till end of turn. I think this card is really good, and in some situations I think it's even better than Heroic Intervention. So I definitely expect this to see play, and 100% this is going to be an amazing commander card. Up next at number 7, we have another creature. This one, I don't have any cards to compare it to. We've made a lot of comparisons so far, but this is Beza the Bounding Spring. So this is a mythic. It's a 4 mana, 4/5 legendary creature, elemental elk. It costs 2 white and white, and it says whenever it enters, create a treasure token if an opponent controls more lands than you. You gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens if an opponent controls more creatures than you, and draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. So one thing that a lot of people say when evaluating cards is that they'll point out that a card seems very win more. And what they mean by that is, yeah, maybe the card seems good, but it's only good when you're already ahead, which turns out to be true for a lot of cards. But this card is kind of the opposite of that. This card is great when you're behind on any resource, basically. Like, it has good stats. It's a 4/5 for 4. But if you're behind at all on anything, this is going to get you more value. If you're really behind, this card is going to be amazing because you could get all 4 of these modes just by playing this 4-drop, and that's so much value packed into one card. I imagine it's probably really easy to get all 4 modes if you're playing Commander because, you know, you have 3 different opponents to check these abilities with, but I think this card is very good, and I think it probably will see play in Standard. Moving on to the next card, so up at number 6, we have an uncommon. This is Long River's Pull. So this is an instant. It costs a blue and a blue, so 2 mana. It has Gift a card, and it says counter target creature spell. If the gift was promised, instead counter target spell. So this is really close to just counter spell in Standard. No, it's not counter spell because you are giving your opponent a card if you play it as a counter spell, but a lot of the time you don't care about that because you'll be countering a key spell, and that's worth giving your opponent a card because maybe they're never going to get the chance to use that card. But also, even if you don't gift a card, you could just counter a creature spell with this and play this as basically an Essence Scatter, which has been a standard playable card many times in the past. And also, this is probably good for Commander too, because with the gift things, you promise an opponent the thing, so like you could counter one opponent's spell and just give the gift to somebody else. It's kind of an interesting politics thing you can do, but it seems good for Commander as well. So moving on, we're halfway through the top 10 now. Up at number 5, this is a card which initially I didn't have in the list. I had it in the honorable mentions, but then I read it some more and I realized just some more applications you can use for this that just really put it up into the actual top 10 for me. So this is Igra, Eater of All. This is a mythic legendary elemental cat. It costs 5 mana, 3 a black and a green, and it's a 6/6. It says ward, sacrifice a food. Other creatures are food artifacts in addition to the other types, and they have the food ability. Whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Igra, Eater of All. So the thing that I really like about this card is that it turns every creature other than itself into an artifact. Like, I don't really even have to care about the fact that they're food, but that means every other creature now becomes susceptible to artifact removal. So if you have something that says destroy all artifacts, you could just destroy all other creatures. And then when you do that, you're going to put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on this thing. But then there's that ward ability. This is one thing that kind of pushes it into the actual top 10 for me. The ward, sacrifice of food. Because, yeah, if your opponent has a creature, they'll be able to pay the ward cost because their creature is going to be a food, or maybe they'll just have a food they can sacrifice. But if you're playing against a deck that doesn't play many creatures, or maybe even say like a creatureless control deck, this card basically just has hexproof. Because if your opponent doesn't have any creatures, they can't sacrifice the food to pay the ward costs, so they just can't really target this with anything. This card is it's more flexible than I initially thought it was, and I think that's very cool. And then it almost goes without saying, but this is an awesome commander. Like, I try not to put cards in the top 10 if their only application is that they're a good commander, but this is a good commander, and I think this is good outside of commander as well. So moving on to number 4, this one is in here for some of the same reasons as the previous card, but this is Maha, it's Feathers Knight. Once again, this is a mythic legendary elemental creature. It's an elemental bird. It also costs 5 mana, 3 a black and a black. This one is a 6/5. It has flying and trample and ward, discard a card. And then also, creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. So first off, a 6/5 flying trample for 5 is good. Those are good stats. Like, this card has a very good body. Ward, discard a card is also great. We know that because of Graveyard Trespasser, which saw a lot of play in Standard. I think it saw a little bit of play outside of Standard as well, but Ward, discard a card is a very good ward ability because sometimes your opponent doesn't have a card to discard. But then there's that last ability. Creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. So one thing that a lot of people have pointed out is that you can pair this with something like Kervek or Knight of Souls Betrayal, and your opponents just can't have creatures. So that's a very powerful thing to do. And then also, this is great with any cards that can ping creatures for 1. That makes those into just removal spells every time you use them. This also is going to be a really popular commander, I think. But once again, I think it's good enough to see play outside of commander as well. So now we're moving into the top 3. These are ones that I put a fair bit of thought into, and you know, I had to shift around the placement of a lot of these cards, and these are the ones that landed in what I think are the top 3 cards of the set. So coming in at number 3, we have another 1-drop. This is Iridescent Vine Lasher. This just costs 1 black mana. It's a 1/2 Lizard Assassin. It has Offspring 2, so if you pay 2 mana, as you cast the spell, you can make a copy of it. The copy is a 1/1. And it has Landfall. It says, whenever a land you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. This is another card that I talked about a little bit in my previous video, but I think this might actually be modern playable. And the reason for that is because it works so well with fetch lands. So this is good if you play it on turn 1, but I think this is even better if you play it on turn 3, because at that point you'll have 2 copies of this, and it's basically 2 copies of the same creature. Like, one of them is a 1/1 instead of a 1/2. That's the only difference. But then you'll have 2 copies of this landfall ability, so that means that whenever you play a fetch land, you get to do 4 damage to your opponent. Because you're going to play your fetch land, trigger both of these cards, then you'll sacrifice it and get another land and do 2 more damage to your opponent. And if you have effects that let you play extra lands, or like maybe this could go into like a weird kind of black scapeshift type of deck, like you could just kill your opponent that way. This will probably be good in standard. It'll pair well with Fabled Passage, which is in the set as well. You know, it has relevant creature types. Lizard is a relevant creature type now. It has lots of synergies in this set, but also it's an assassin too, so it is an outlaw and it does commit crimes because it targets opponents. So for 1 mana, I think this card is really push, and yeah, I think this should be in the top 3 cards in the set. Now moving on to number 2. What do I think is the second best card in the set? This is another one that's quite similar to a card we've seen in the past. This is Salvation Swan. It costs 4 mana, 3 and a white. It's a bird cleric and it's a 3/3. It has flash and flying, and it says, whenever Salvation Swan or another bird you control enters, exile up to 1 target creature you control without flying. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So, years ago, back in, I guess, Innistrad block standard, there was a card that was very popular that actually looks a lot like this. Even the art looks a lot like this. Restoration Angel. That card kind of dominated the format for a while. And this card is very similar to that, but this is kind of a theme that I'm seeing with a lot of these cards, is that they're similar to previous cards, but they're better in a lot of ways. And one thing that makes this card better, in some situations at least, is that it triggers whenever it enters or another bird enters. So if you're playing different birds, you can get extra triggers out of this. But then also you can use this to be giving your creatures flying counters, giving your creatures evasion, ones which might otherwise not have evasion. But then another cool thing is that Restoration Angel would immediately flicker your creature, it would exile it, and then return to play right away. This card returns it to play at the beginning of the next end step, so you can have some cool play with that kind of ability in terms of like playing around Wraths maybe. Or you can use it to set up your own cards, like say you have maybe a creature that has 1 toughness and you want to play something that does 1 or 2 damage to everything. You could play this and then exile that creature, it's safely in exile, cast your spell, and then it's going to come back at the end of the turn. With a flying counter, by the way. It's just this card is so similar to Restoration Angel, and we saw how good that card was in the past, that I think this is also going to be very good. I think this is still a very relevant effect to have in Standard. And I guess I should have pointed this out, but it's kind of the obvious use for this card. But you know, the main thing you want to do with this card is reuse your Enter the Battlefield triggers. Now, moving on to number 1. This is what I think is the best card in the set, and this is one that I think might surprise a lot of people. This isn't uncommon. This is Parting Gust. So what does this card do? It costs 2 mana, a white and a white. It's an instant, and it says gift a tapped fish. Exile target non-token creature. If the gift wasn't promised, return that creature to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So, at face value, this is a very good removal spell, but this is also a very flexible spell, not necessarily even a removal spell. So if you use this as a removal spell, probably you're going to give your opponent the gift, but a tapped fish is a very mediocre gift. It's just a 1/1 creature that comes into play tapped. A lot of the time, that it's essentially as good as giving your opponent nothing. Yes, there will be times when the fish is relevant, but a lot of the time, it's just going to be an irrelevant gift. So at that point, this is a 2 mana instant speed spell that exiles a non-token creature. So that's if you play this as a removal spell, but you can also play this as like a flicker type of spell to use on your own creatures. One very popular card that people play is Essence Flux, and this is basically that, but 1 more mana and in white. So on one hand, this is a good removal spell, and then on the other hand, this is like a white Essence Flux. You can use it to save your creature from a removal spell and have it come back with a +1/+1 counter, or you could use it to just flicker something and reuse and enter the battlefield trigger. And it's kind of for those reasons that I think this card is so good, is that it's a good version of two different cards in one. It's a really flexible card, and there are a couple of things holding this card back. The main thing being that it costs white, so the fact that it's double white is actually a pretty significant drawback because that makes it a lot less splashable. So if this is to see play in Standard, I expect it would mostly be in like a mono white aggro deck or a mid-range deck, something like that. But those are both viable types of decks. And then the other thing that holds it back is that it exiles a non-token creature, so you can't just use this as a removal spell on a token, which could matter a lot of the time, but outside of those two drawbacks, I think this card has so much going for it, and yeah, I think this is the best card in the set. So that was my top 10 list for Bloomburrow. I'll just throw up a slide here with some other cards. These are ones which I also picked out and ones that I was looking at that I thought were quite good, which didn't actually make it into the top 10 and weren't in the honorable mentions, but I think these are some very good cards as well, which could be in consideration, and probably a lot of them would be in other people's top 10 lists as well. But let me know what you think. How is this different from your top 10 list? I imagine it is probably going to be different from a lot of people's list. If there's something that I missed with any of these cards, let me know. I'd be happy to read in the comments. And let me know what's the card that you're most excited about with this set. But otherwise though, thanks for watching if you're still watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I'd encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description below. If you'd like to buy any cool custom playmats or tokens, you can find those in my store, which is linked in the video description below as well. And also, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all the patrons that support me on Patreon. But otherwise though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.